Human guided an alien girl through the drifting fog. Her dawn gesture made the journey mean more. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. Jake Thompson stood still in the middle of the dense fog, the cold morning air biting at his skin. He squinted through the mist, trying to make out the silhouette ahead. His boots crunched softly on the damp ground as he moved forward, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The world around him was a blur of gray, the fog swirling like a living thing, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of him. He had been walking for hours, trying to reach the small cabin he had heard about, but the dense fog made it nearly impossible to find his bearings. The only thing that kept him going was the sound of soft footsteps beside him. Lyra, the alien girl he had found lost in the wilderness the night before. She had collapsed at his feet, her pale blue skin nearly blending into the fog. At first, Jake had hesitated, unsure of what to do. He had never met anyone from her species before. Her people, the Xerians, were a rare sight on Earth. But something about her helpless state had stirred something inside him. Now, as they trudged together through the thick mist, Jake kept a protective hand on her shoulder, guiding her through the unknown. Despite her delicate appearance, Lyra was no fragile creature. Her species was known for their resilience, and even though she had been weakened by exhaustion and injury, she had insisted on continuing the journey. Her silvery hair, which shone faintly in the light of the moon, swayed gently with each step. Jake could feel the tension in her body, the hesitation, but she never once spoke of stopping. "We're almost there," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if it was true. The fog made it impossible to judge distance, and the cold was starting to seep into his bones. But something about the way Lyra kept moving forward, despite everything, gave him the strength to keep going. Her calm determination was contagious. After a while, Lyra stopped walking, her hand gently touching his arm to get his attention. She looked up at him, her pale violet eyes glowing faintly in the fog, and Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Without saying a word, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small device, holding it out to him. "For you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. The gesture took him by surprise. He didn't know what the device was, but the meaning behind it was clear. She was offering something, a symbol of trust, perhaps even gratitude. Jake took the device from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. He didn't know what to say, but the moment felt significant, more than just an exchange of physical objects. It felt like a connection, one that had been built over the course of their journey, step by step, through the fog. Lyra smiled at him then, a small, tender expression that seemed to light up her face despite the gloom around them. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was warm, and for the first time since he had met her, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't just the fog that was lifting. It was the weight of doubt and fear that had been holding him back. As the first light of dawn began to break through the mist, casting a soft glow over the world, Jake realized that this journey, this strange adventure that had started with a chance encounter, had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. Lyra's simple gesture, her silent trust, made the entire journey feel worth it. It had given him something more than just survival. It had given him a sense of purpose, and maybe, just maybe, a connection that transcended the boundaries of species. Together, they walked on, the fog beginning to lift as the new day unfolded before them. The sun had just begun to rise, casting soft orange light across the dense forest as Jake and Lyra continued their journey through the thick fog. The air was still, but the world around them seemed to be waking up slowly, like the first stirrings of a new day. The mist clung to the trees, making everything appear ethereal and distant, as if they were walking through a dream. Jake could feel the weight of the morning pressing down on him, the chill of the fog seeping into his bones, but it was a different kind of cold this time. It wasn't the biting, stinging cold of the night. It was a kind of quiet, peaceful chill that came with the dawn, a sign that they were no longer trapped in the suffocating darkness. The journey was far from over, but in that moment, With the soft glow of the morning light beginning to filter through the fog, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. Lyra, walking beside him, had become something more than just a companion. She had become a symbol of something Jake couldn't quite name, a force that made him question everything he had thought he knew about himself, about the world. She was a stranger, a creature from another world, yet her presence felt so natural beside him, as if she had always been there. He glanced over at her as she walked, her violet eyes scanning the forest around them, her silvery hair gently moving in the light breeze. Despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on both of them, there was a quiet determination in her steps. "Are you all right?" Jake asked, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. Lyra looked up at him, her face softening as if she had been lost in thought. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice calm, but there was a trace of weariness in her tone. "Thank you, Jake, for everything." Jake didn't know what to say. He had been helping her out of a sense of duty at first, a desire to get her to safety, but now it felt like something deeper, something unspoken, had formed between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. She trusted him, and for the first time in a long time, Jake realized he trusted her too. The fog seemed to grow thicker as they moved forward, and the trees around them began to look like strange, shadowy figures, towering over them like silent watchers. The path had become less defined, and Jake found himself leading the way more confidently, his mind focused entirely on the path ahead, the soft sound of Lyra's footsteps. Following him. It was in that moment, as they moved deeper into the forest, that he realized how much he had changed. The old Jake, the one who had always kept to himself, who had never let anyone get too close, would never have done this, would never have sacrificed his time and energy for anyone, let alone an alien from another world. But now he couldn't help it. He felt a connection to Lyra, something that went beyond words. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone who needed him, just as he needed her. "We're getting closer," Jake said after a long silence, his voice steady, though the doubt still lingered in his chest. He didn't know if the cabin he was hoping for was even real, but the thought of getting her somewhere safe kept him going. Lyra didn't say anything, but her presence beside him spoke volumes. It was as if she was giving him the strength to keep moving, to keep pushing forward even when the path was unclear. They walked in silence for a while longer, the fog starting to thin as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The trees began to part, and ahead of them, Jake spotted the faint outline of a structure, a small, weathered cabin, just as he had hoped. His heart raced in his chest. They had made it. They were almost there. Lyra, still walking beside him, turned to him with a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Thank you, Jake," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. He met her gaze, feeling a warmth spread through him. "You're welcome," he replied, though he knew that words couldn't fully express the way he was feeling. This wasn't just about getting her to safety. It was about something more, something that had grown between them over the course of their journey. As they approached the cabin, Jake realized that this was only the beginning of their journey. There was still much to face, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. With Lyra by his side, he felt like anything was possible. The door to the cabin creaked as Jake pushed it open, revealing the warm, dimly lit interior. He stepped inside first, followed closely by Lyra, who hesitated for just a moment before entering. The cabin was small but cozy, with a low wooden ceiling and a fire crackling softly in the hearth. A single window let in the soft morning light, casting a golden glow over everything. Jake closed the door behind them, securing it against the elements outside. The fog was still thick, but the warmth of the cabin felt like a relief, like they had crossed some invisible threshold into safety. Lyra took a slow, cautious step forward, her violet eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. She looked tired, but there was a quiet sense of relief in her posture now that they were finally inside. Jake set down the small pack he had been carrying, his hands sore from the long walk. He turned to Lyra, who had walked over to the fire, her silhouette framed by the dancing flames. She was no longer the same alien girl he had found in the fog. She had become something more, someone he had helped, and in doing so, someone who had helped him in return. He could feel it now, the shift in their relationship. It wasn't just about him guiding her through the fog. It was about them both finding something they hadn't expected, trust. Jake stepped toward her slowly, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. "Are you all right?" he asked again, his voice quieter this time, almost as if he was afraid to break the peaceful silence that had settled between them. Lyra didn't turn to face him immediately. Instead, she stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I'm not used to being cared for," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Where I come from, weakness is punished." Jake's heart ached at her words, though he didn't fully understand the weight of them. "You're not weak," he replied, his voice firm. "No one is weak for needing help." Lyra's eyes flickered toward him, the faintest trace of vulnerability crossing her face before she quickly masked it again. "You're different, Jake," she said, almost as if to herself. "I never thought I would meet someone like you." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure what she meant by it, but the sincerity in her voice left him speechless. Instead of trying to explain, he simply nodded and took a seat across from her by the fire. They sat in silence. For a while, the only sounds in the room the crackling of the fire and the occasional shift in the wind outside. Jake felt the tension in his shoulders start to ease, the exhaustion of the journey finally catching up with him. He had been focused on Lyra for so long, on getting her to safety, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about what came next. But now that they were here, he realized he didn't know what to do. He had promised to get her to safety, but what did that mean for the both of them? Lyra shifted slightly, drawing his attention back to her. She had been silent for a while, but her eyes were now fixed on the fire, her face soft and contemplative. Jake noticed a faint tremor in her hands, barely noticeable, but it was there. She was still afraid. Even here, in the warmth and safety of the cabin, she wasn't completely free from the fear that had followed her since the moment they had met. Slowly, Jake reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, hoping his words would reach her. "You're safe here." Lyra's gaze flickered toward him, and for a moment, there was a connection between them, something unspoken but undeniable. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed her fingers to brush against his, a small but significant gesture. Jake's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time since they had started their journey, Jake felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding, of mutual respect. And in that silence, Jake realized something else. He had already begun to care for her. He didn't know how or when it had happened, but it had. And that simple truth made everything feel right. They were no longer two strangers lost in the fog. They were something more, something that couldn't be easily explained or understood. But it was real. And in that moment, that was enough. The cabin was quieter now, the warmth from the fire filling the room with a sense of calm. Jake sat across from Lyra, his eyes studying the faint smile that lingered on her lips. She had relaxed somewhat since their arrival, but there was still an underlying tension in her posture that didn't escape his notice. He knew that what they had gone through, what they had survived together, had left its mark on her. The fire crackled, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lyra's gaze was fixed on the flickering light, her face soft, lost in thought. Jake didn't want to disturb her, but the silence between them felt heavy, as though both of them were waiting for something to change. "Lyra," he said, his voice quiet but steady. She turned to look at him, her violet eyes meeting his for the first time since they had entered the cabin. "What happens now?" he asked. There was no anger or frustration in his tone, only curiosity and something else, concern. Lyra hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her cloak. "I don't know," she answered softly, the uncertainty in her voice echoing the doubt that had settled in her heart. I thought I would be alone, that no one would care enough to help me. But now, I'm not sure what to do." Jake felt a surge of empathy, but he didn't know how to make it better. He didn't have all the answers, but he had one thing to offer, his presence. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said, his words simple, but carrying a weight of sincerity. "You're not alone." Lyra's eyes softened, and for a moment, Jake could see the flicker of something in her eyes, a hope, maybe, or the possibility of something new. She didn't respond right away, but he saw her shoulders relax, her posture shifting slightly, as if she was allowing herself to accept the offer of companionship. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had inched closer, pulling them together in a way that made everything else seem distant. Lyra exhaled slowly, as though releasing a breath she had been holding for far too long. "I never thought I'd find a human who would help me like this," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. "You're different, Jake." Her words hung in the air between them, and Jake could feel the truth of them, even if he didn't fully understand what she meant. It wasn't about being different, he realized. It was about being human. "I'm just trying to do what's right," Jake replied, his voice steady. "I don't know much about your world, or what you've been through, but I know what it's like to feel alone. I didn't want that for you." Lyra studied him for a long moment, her gaze intense, but not unkind. "You're a strange human," she said softly, the hint of a smile playing at her lips. "But I'm glad I met you." The air between them shifted again, the tension easing, and for the first time since they had met, Jake felt as though the weight of their journey together was no longer a burden. It was something more, a bond, an understanding that had formed between them without either of them realizing it. The fire crackled again, breaking the silence, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet was enough. As the evening wore on, the room grew darker, the shadows deepening around them, but the warmth from the fire and the presence of each other kept the cold at bay. They were no longer two strangers lost in the fog. They were two souls who had found something in each other, something that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. The night stretched on, and as they both sat in the warmth of the cabin, they realized that whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, casting a soft glow on the worn wooden floors. Jake stretched, his muscles sore from the long journey, but the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the cabin made it all feel bearable. Lyra had already risen, and he could hear the soft rustling of her movements as she adjusted her cloak. It had been a few days since they had arrived at the cabin, and the days had passed quietly, with little more than small conversations and the occasional shared silence. Still, there was something unspoken between them, something that had grown in the stillness. Jake didn't mind the silence. It felt comfortable, as if the world outside had been paused for just a moment, and all that mattered was the present. He stood up, stretching his arms over his head, and walked over to the window, peering outside. The fog had lifted, revealing the rugged terrain beyond. The forest stretched for miles, and in the distance, he could see the mountains rising against the pale blue sky. It was beautiful, but also daunting. They were still far from any real civilization, and Jake wasn't sure how long they could stay here before needing to move on. "Jake," Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to find her standing near the hearth, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her violet eyes meeting his. "About what comes next." Jake nodded, stepping away from the window and moving toward her. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, as if he already knew the answer. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "I don't know what's waiting for me outside this cabin," she said, her tone tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know where to go or what to do. All I've known is running." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of truth. Jake could feel her vulnerability, the way she was finally opening up about the fear that had been simmering beneath her calm exterior. He stepped closer to her, his gaze softening. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. "I'm here with you. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out together." Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she finally gave a small nod. "I'm not used to this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Used to what?" Jake asked, his curiosity piqued. "To someone caring for me. To someone wanting to help me." She lowered her gaze, and Jake could see the flicker of something in her eyes. It was a quiet, almost hidden fear, a fear of depending on someone else, of trusting someone completely. "You can trust me, Lyra," Jake said softly. "You don't have to be afraid." She met his gaze again, and for a brief moment, there was something in her eyes that Jake couldn't place. It was fleeting, like the shadow of a memory she was trying to push away. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by her usual calm exterior. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady once more. Jake didn't know what the future held for them, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The cabin, though small, had become a refuge for both of them, a place where they could stop and breathe, even if just for a while. But it wouldn't be enough forever. Sooner or later, they would have to leave, face the world again, and confront whatever dangers awaited them. And yet, in the quiet moments between them, Jake found a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but with Lyra by his side, he felt like he could face anything. The journey was far from over, but together, they would walk it, step by step. The days passed slowly in the cabin, each one a quiet repetition of the last. The world outside was still shrouded in mist, but inside, Jake and Lyra found a kind of peace. They had settled into a rhythm. Jake would gather firewood and check the surrounding area for any signs of danger, while Lyra focused on studying the strange world she now found herself in. She had always been a warrior, trained to fight and survive in hostile environments. But now, with her body weakened and her mind clouded by uncertainty, she found herself relying on Jake in ways she never had before. It was a difficult adjustment. Lyra was proud, fiercely independent, and used to doing everything herself. But Jake's kindness, his quiet presence, had a way of breaking through her defenses. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the fire crackled in the hearth, Lyra stood by the window, staring out into the darkening wilderness. She had become restless lately, a sense of unease settling in her bones. She had been running for so long, running from her past, from the people who wanted her dead, and now, for the first time, she wasn't sure what to do. She had always known her path: fight, survive, escape. But here, with Jake, she felt like she had lost that sense of purpose. "Jake?" she called softly, turning away from the window. He looked up from his work, his face warm from the firelight. "Yeah. Do you ever wonder if we're just hiding here?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I mean, what happens after this? What happens when the world outside finds us?" Jake set down the piece of wood he was holding and stood up. He walked over to where Lyra stood, his gaze searching her face for signs of fear or uncertainty. "We can't hide forever," he said, his voice steady. "But we don't have to face it alone." Lyra met his gaze, her violet eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "I don't know how to face it," she admitted. "I've spent so long running from everything, from everyone. I don't know if I can go back to that life." Jake stepped closer, his presence offering a sense of reassurance. "You don't have to go back," he said, his voice firm. "You don't have to be who you were before. You're not alone anymore. And you don't have to run anymore, either." Lyra felt a lump form in her throat at his words, the truth of them sinking in slowly. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was nothing more than a soldier, a weapon, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about anything else. But now, with Jake by her side, she was starting to realize that maybe there was more to her life than just surviving. She took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For what?" Jake asked, his tone gentle. "For showing me that there's something worth fighting for," she said, her voice steadier now. "For making me see that I don't have to be alone in this." Jake smiled, the warmth in his expression easing the tension in the room. He had never expected this. Never expected to find someone like Lyra, someone whose strength and vulnerability had drawn him in. But in the quiet moments, in the space between their words, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A connection. Something that went beyond just survival, beyond just the need to keep moving. For the first time, he wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he didn't want to face it without Lyra. The fire crackled as they stood there together, the warmth from the flames filling the room, and for a moment, the world outside seemed distant, as if it didn't matter. They were here, in this cabin, together, and that was enough. At least for now. The days continued to pass, and the silence in the cabin grew more comfortable with each one. Jake and Lyra had settled into a routine, but the weight of what lay ahead was always in the back of their minds. The fog had finally lifted, revealing a clearer view of the surrounding wilderness. The cabin, though small, felt like a safe haven, but Jake knew it was only temporary. One day, they would have to leave and face the world outside. That thought lingered in his mind, but for now, he focused on the present, on the quiet moments he shared with Lyra. He had come to realize that she was more than just a companion in their shared survival. She had become someone he cared for deeply, though neither of them had spoken of it aloud. Lyra, too, had begun to open up in her own way. She had always been reserved, her emotions hidden behind the walls she had built over years of battle and loss. But with Jake, she had started to trust again, to let down the guard she had kept so tightly locked. It wasn't easy for her. Jake could see that. But every day, he saw more of the person she was beneath the warrior exterior, the quiet strength, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire, Lyra finally spoke of something that had been on her mind for a while. "Jake," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking about everything. About my past, and what's left of it." Jake turned to face her, his gaze steady, knowing this was something important. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I used to think I had it all figured out," she said, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the table. "I was always fighting, always running, always trying to stay ahead of my enemies. But now, I don't know what to do with myself." She paused, looking down at her hands, as if lost in thought. "I'm not that person anymore. I don't know who I am now." Jake felt a pang in his chest at her words. He had known that Lyra's past was filled with pain, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel all the more real. He stood up and walked over to where she sat, crouching down beside her. "You don't have to have it all figured out," he said gently. "You don't have to be anyone other than who you are right now. You're here, with me, and that's enough." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I never thought I'd find peace again," she said, almost to herself. "But with you, I feel like I'm starting to understand what that means." Jake smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "I feel the same way." They sat there in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, each lost in their own thoughts. The connection they had formed over the past few days had grown stronger, and though neither of them said it, they both knew that they were no longer just survivors. They were something more, something that couldn't be easily explained, but something that felt real. Later that evening, as the stars began to emerge in the dark sky, Jake and Lyra stood outside the cabin, looking up at the vast expanse above them. The night was clear, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Jake could feel the weight of the world still pressing on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so heavy. With Lyra by his side, he felt like they could face whatever came next, together. The future was uncertain, and the world outside was full of dangers they couldn't yet imagine. But in that moment, standing beneath the stars, Jake felt a sense of hope, a hope that had been missing from his life for far too long. They didn't know what the future held, but for now, they had each other. And that was enough. The morning after their quiet moment under the stars, the cabin felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between Jake and Lyra, a shift in their relationship that neither had expected but both felt deeply. The warmth of the fire that morning was comforting, and the soft light filtering through the small window made everything inside seem peaceful, even though the world outside was uncertain. They both knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They had to move on, face whatever was waiting for them. But for now, they didn't speak of it. Instead, they spent the day in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Jake gathered firewood and checked the surrounding area, while Lyra continued her quiet study of the world around her. She had always been observant, but now, as she looked at Earth through new eyes, she felt something stir within her, something that had been dormant for so long. The realization that she didn't have to fight every battle alone was beginning to settle in. By the time evening came, they were both restless, the stillness of the cabin pressing in on them. They sat by the fire once again, and this time, it was Lyra who broke the silence. "Jake," she began, her voice hesitant but determined. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being alone anymore." Jake turned to look at her, surprised to hear her voice break the quiet. She was looking at the fire, her hands resting on her lap. "I've spent my entire life pushing people away," she continued, her words slow but steady. "I didn't want anyone to see the things I've seen, to know what I've done. But with you, it's different." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how much her words meant, how much they revealed. "I don't need you to understand everything," Lyra added quickly, glancing up at him. "I just need you to know that I'm trying, Jake. I'm trying to let go of the fear." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "You don't have to do it all at once," he said softly. "We're in this together, Lyra. One step at a time." She smiled then, a small, fleeting expression, but it was enough to make Jake's chest tighten with emotion. He had never expected this. He had never expected to find someone like Lyra, someone so strong, yet so vulnerable. She had been through so much, yet here she was, trying to trust again. And he realized, in that moment, that he would do whatever it took to help her. They sat there for a while longer, the fire crackling softly, each of them lost in their thoughts. The outside world, with its dangers and uncertainties, felt far away for a while. It was just the two of them, in that small cabin, sharing a quiet moment of peace. As the night grew darker, Lyra stood and walked to the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the firelight. "I know we have to leave," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "But for tonight, it feels like we have time." Jake stood and joined her at the window, looking out at the quiet wilderness beyond. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. With Lyra by his side, he felt a sense of calm, a hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. "We'll leave when the time is right," he said softly, his words carrying a weight of promise. Lyra turned to look at him, her expression serious but warm. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, "for being here." Jake smiled, his heart full. "Always," he replied. And for the first time, he truly believed it. Together, they would face whatever came next. The days in the cabin had become a comforting routine, but Jake knew the time was approaching when they would have to leave. The world outside was waiting, full of uncertainty, but for now, they had each other. Lyra had grown stronger in the time they had spent together. The fear that had once been so visible in her eyes was now replaced by a quiet determination. She still carried the weight of her past, but it no longer seemed to define her. Jake could see the change in her, the way she held herself, the way she spoke. There was a new sense of purpose in her every move. One evening, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Jake found himself sitting across from Lyra. She had been quiet lately, lost in her thoughts, and he wondered what was on her mind. He could tell she was preparing for something, though he wasn't sure what. "Lyra," he said gently, breaking the silence. "What's going on in that head of yours?" She looked up at him, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but steady, "about what comes next, about where we go from here." Jake nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I've been thinking about that too," he said, his voice steady. "We can't stay here forever, but we don't have to rush either. We'll figure it out together." Lyra's smile grew a little wider, and she looked down at her hands for a moment before speaking again. "I don't know where we're going, Jake, but I know I don't want to face it alone, and I don't want to go back to who I was." Jake's heart tightened at her words. He had known for a while that Lyra's past weighed heavily on her, but hearing her speak so openly about it was something new. "You don't have to go back," Jake said, his voice firm with conviction. "You're not the person you were before, and you're not alone anymore. We'll figure out where we go from here, but I'm not going anywhere." Lyra's eyes softened as she looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper, shining in her gaze. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said quietly. Jake didn't know what to say to that. The truth was, he hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't expected to find someone like Lyra, someone whose strength and vulnerability had become so intertwined with his own journey. He had come here to help her, to get her to safety, but somewhere along the way, he had realized that he needed her just as much as she needed him. "We're in this together," Jake finally said, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it side by side." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound filling the room. It was as if, in that quiet, everything else in the world had fallen away, leaving just the two of them. And for the first time since they had met, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but with Lyra beside him, he knew he wasn't facing it alone. When the night finally came to an end, they stood together, side by side, staring out at the vast wilderness beyond the cabin. The stars shone brightly above them, and Jake felt a quiet sense of hope in his chest. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't have to face it alone. With Lyra by his side, he was ready for whatever came next.